Imagine being tortured not for what you did, but for how you looked. That's exactly what happened to a young slave named Sporus in ancient Rome. His face was his death sentence. Emperor Nero had just killed his own wife in a fit of rage, but when the grief hit, he became obsessed with bringing her back. So when he spotted Sporus, a slave who bore an uncanny resemblance to his dead Empress, Nero saw his chance for resurrection. What followed was one of history's most twisted acts of imperial madness. Sporus would be castrated, dressed as a woman, and forced into a marriage ceremony with the most powerful man on earth. His torture wasn't a punishment, it was Nero's sick idea of love. But what happened to him after Nero's death was even worse. This is the real story of how resembling the wrong person could destroy your entire existence. To understand Sporus' nightmare, you need to meet the woman who started it all, Poppaea Sabina. She wasn't just beautiful, she was dangerously beautiful. The kind of woman who could make emperors abandon their wives and start wars. Poppaea had already been married twice when she caught Nero's eye. Her second husband, Otho, was one of Nero's closest friends, but when the emperor wanted something, friendship meant nothing. Nero simply banished Otho to a distant province and took his wife. Nothing says best friends forever quite like stealing your buddy's woman and sending him to the ancient equivalent of Siberia. For 5 years, Poppaea ruled Nero as much as he ruled Rome. She convinced him to murder his own mother, Agrippina. To be fair, this wasn't exactly a normal mother-son relationship. Agrippina had already tried to poison Nero multiple times. Apparently, family dinners were a real gamble in the imperial palace. She'd also murdered her way to power, including poisoning her own husband, Emperor Claudius. So when Poppaea whispered in Nero's ear that mommy dearest had to go, it was less convince your loving son to commit matricide and more finish what's already been a very messy family feud. That kind of persuasion is terrifyingly effective. Poppaea wasn't done redecorating Nero's family tree. She also pushed him to divorce and execute his first wife, Octavia. Poor Octavia's crime? Being boring and legitimate in a world where your stepmother turned mother-in-law keeps trying to murder your husband. Being a stable, drama-free wife was apparently grounds for execution. Ancient historians described Poppaea as ambitious, ruthless, and absolutely stunning. She had golden hair that became the standard of beauty across the empire. She was basically the ancient world's ultimate mean girl, beautiful, manipulative, and absolutely lethal to anyone in her way. But Poppaea made one fatal mistake. She got pregnant. In 65 AD, while heavily pregnant with their second child, she dared to criticize Nero for coming home late from the chariot races. Big mistake. Nero, drunk and furious, kicked her in the stomach so hard that she died on the spot. The emperor had just killed the only person he truly loved, and that's when his mind completely snapped. Suddenly, the most powerful man in the world was consumed by grief and guilt. He organized elaborate funeral games that lasted for days, had Poppaea's body covered in expensive spices instead of cremated, an honor usually reserved for foreign royalty, and even tried to have her declared a goddess. Because apparently, if you can't be a good husband while your wife is alive, you can always overcompensate after you've literally kicked her to death. But none of it brought her back. And that's when Nero's obsession turned truly twisted. If he couldn't resurrect Poppaea, maybe he could recreate her. After killing Poppaea, Nero entered what we might charitably call his unhinged widower phase. The same man who had casually murdered his mother and first wife was now devastated by grief. Apparently, murdering family members was just Tuesday for Nero, but accidentally killing the woman he actually loved, that broke his brain completely. The emperor became obsessed with finding Poppaea's replacement, not just any replacement, an exact replacement. He scoured the empire looking for women who resembled his dead wife. Think of it as the world's most disturbing casting call. Wanted, golden-haired beauty for emperor's wife. Must look exactly like previous wife. Previous wife died under mysterious circumstances. No questions asked. But here's where it gets really weird. None of the women were good enough. They didn't have quite the right nose, their hair wasn't the perfect shade of gold, or they simply couldn't fill the Poppaea-shaped hole in Nero's twisted heart. The emperor was like a psychotic Goldilocks. This one's too short. This one's too tall. This one doesn't remind me enough of my dead wife whom I murdered. Nero even tried marrying a woman named Statilia Messalina, but that didn't work either. She had the unfortunate problem of being her own person instead of a Poppaea clone. The marriage was doomed from the start, because Nero wasn't looking for a wife, he was looking for a resurrection. Meanwhile, the Roman people watched their emperor's increasingly bizarre behavior with growing alarm. This was the same man who had allegedly fiddled while Rome burned, who performed on stage like a common actor, and who now seemed to be having a very public mental breakdown over his dead wife. Even by Roman imperial standards, which weren't exactly high, this was getting concerning. But Nero wasn't done yet. If he couldn't find an exact female replica of Poppaea, maybe he needed to think outside the box. Maybe he needed to be more creative about his requirements. That's when his eyes landed on a young slave named Sporus. Sporus was probably just trying to live his life when fate decided to completely ruin it. He was a young slave, likely a teenager, living somewhere in the vast Roman Empire. His biggest worry should have been avoiding a beating from his master or getting enough food for the day. Instead, he had the cosmic misfortune of looking exactly like a dead empress. Picture the moment when Nero first saw him. The emperor's eyes widened. In recognition, his heart probably skipped a beat, and Sporus' life was instantly over. It was like winning the worst lottery in human history. Congratulations, you've won a one-way ticket to imperial insanity. What exactly did Sporus look like? Ancient sources describe him as having delicate, feminine features, and that same golden hair that had made Poppaea famous across the empire. In any other time and place, these might have been considered blessings. Under Nero's gaze, they were a death sentence with extra steps. The resemblance was so striking that it apparently gave Nero chills. This wasn't just, oh, they kind of look similar, this was, holy gods. It's like Poppaea has returned from the underworld level of similarity. Some historians suggest Sporus might have actually been related to Poppaea, perhaps a distant cousin or the child of a relative who had been enslaved. For Sporus, the moment of recognition must have been terrifying. Slaves learned to read their master's expressions for survival, and whatever Sporus saw in Nero's face that day couldn't have been good. Maybe it was obsession, maybe it was desperate hope, maybe it was the look of a man who had just found the solution to his grief-induced madness. But here's the thing about resembling someone powerful and dead in ancient Rome. It rarely ended well for you. Sporus was about to discover that sometimes looking like the wrong person could be worse than any crime you could actually commit. The emperor had found his replacement. Now came the truly horrific part, making it work. What happened next was so barbaric that even the Romans, who entertained themselves by watching people get eaten by lions, were shocked. Nero decided that if Sporus was going to replace Poppaea, he needed to be made more suitable for the role. The emperor's solution? Castration. Let that sink in for a moment. A slave was about to be mutilated, not as punishment for a crime, but because he had the audacity to look like someone the emperor missed. It's hard to imagine a more twisted logic. You remind me of my beloved dead wife, so I'm going to torture you and then marry you. Even by ancient standards of imperial madness, this was next-level insanity. The procedure itself was brutal. In ancient Rome, castration was typically performed by crushing or cutting away the testicles, often without any form of anesthesia. Sporus would have been held down, probably screaming, while Nero's physicians carried out this horrific mutilation. The survival rate for such procedures was low. Many victims died from blood loss or infection. Sporus' only luck was that he was too valuable to Nero's fantasy to be allowed to die. But the physical mutilation was just the beginning. Once Sporus had healed, assuming he survived the procedure, Nero began the process of turning him into his vision of the perfect Poppaea replacement. The young man was dressed in women's clothing, had his hair styled like the deceased Empress, and was taught to walk, talk, and behave like a Roman noblewoman. Think about the psychological torture here. Not only had Sporus been physically mutilated, but his entire identity was being erased and replaced with that of a dead woman. He was forced to become someone else entirely, someone who reminded his captor of his greatest love and his greatest crime. Then came the final insult, the wedding ceremony. Nero actually married Sporus in a public ceremony, complete with all the traditional Roman wedding rituals. The emperor wore the toga of a Roman groom, while Sporus was dressed as a bride, complete with the flame-colored veil that Roman brides traditionally wore. The ceremony was attended by the Roman elite, who watched in stunned silence as their emperor married a castrated slave girl dressed as a woman. It was political theater at its most disturbing, a public display of imperial madness that no one dared to stop. Welcome to the world's most twisted marriage, where one spouse was a delusional emperor and the other was a mutilated slave desperately trying to survive each day. Sporus' new life as Nero's wife was a constant performance, one where a single wrong move could mean death. Nero treated Sporus exactly like he had treated Poppaea, which was both touching and terrifying. The emperor showered his new wife with jewelry, expensive clothes, and all the luxuries of imperial life. Sporus was given his own retinue of servants, lived in the finest quarters of the palace, and was addressed with the same titles that Poppaea had held. On the surface, it looked like the ultimate rags to riches story. In reality, it was a gilded cage built on mutilation and madness. But here's the thing about pretending to be someone else 24/7, it's exhausting. Sporus had to learn not just how to dress and act like Poppaea, but how to respond to Nero's moods, his reminiscences about the real Poppaea, and his increasingly erratic behavior. Imagine having to nod along while your captor tells you stories about the woman whose identity you've been forced to assume, the woman he murdered and now claims to love through you. The Roman public's reaction was mixed, to put it charitably. Some were horrified by the spectacle, others whispered jokes behind closed doors, and many simply tried to pretend it wasn't happening. After all, what do you say when your emperor marries a castrated slave? Congratulations on your unconventional wedding? The whole situation was so bizarre that even the gossip-loving Romans struggled to find words for it. Nero, meanwhile, seemed genuinely happy with his arrangement. He would introduce Sporus as his wife at public events, take him to the theater, and even kiss him in public. To the emperor, this wasn't a sick charade, it was a successful resurrection. He had brought Poppaea back, and everything was perfect. In his delusional world, for Sporus, every day was a delicate balancing act. He had to be feminine enough to maintain the illusion, but not so much that he accidentally triggered Nero's rage by reminding him too much of the real Poppaea. He had to be loving enough to keep the emperor happy, but not so independent that he seemed to have his own personality. He was living as a ghost of someone else, trapped in a performance that could never end. The psychological toll must have been immense. Sporus wasn't just a prisoner, he was a living monument to Nero's guilt and madness, a daily reminder of imperial violence dressed up as imperial love. In 68 AD, Nero's reign of terror finally came to an end. Faced with multiple rebellions and the Roman Senate declaring him a public enemy, the emperor chose suicide over capture. His last words were reportedly, "What an artist dies in me." Because nothing says humble final moments quite like lamenting your own artistic genius while your empire crumbles around you. For most Romans, Nero's death was cause for celebration. For Sporus, it was the beginning of a new nightmare. What do you do with the castrated widow of a despised emperor? The answer, unfortunately, was nothing good. Enter Otho. Remember him? Poppaea's second husband, the one Nero had exiled to steal his wife. Well, he was back, and he had become emperor in the chaotic year of the four emperors. You'd think Otho might have some sympathy for another victim of Nero's obsessions. Instead, he decided to claim Sporus for himself. Apparently, if you can't have your actual wife back, the next best thing is your rival's twisted replacement version of her. So Sporus found himself passed around like imperial property, which, technically, he was. Otho treated him as a combination of trophy and revenge fantasy, a way to reclaim something that Nero had stolen, even if it was just a horrifically altered substitute. The irony was lost on no one. The man whose wife had been stolen by Nero was now marrying the slave Nero had mutilated to replace that same wife. Roman politics really was just one big, bloody soap opera, but Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before he lost a civil war and killed himself. Sporus was once again without a husband, and his situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Each new emperor had to decide what to do with this living reminder of Nero's madness. The next emperor, Vitellius, took a different approach. Instead of marrying Sporus, he decided to humiliate him publicly. Vitellius forced Sporus to play the role of a raped maiden in gladiatorial games, essentially turning his trauma into entertainment for the masses. If you thought Sporus' life couldn't get worse, well, you underestimated the creative cruelty of Roman emperors. Finally, when Vespasian came to power and brought some stability to the empire, Sporus saw his chance. Rather than face whatever fresh horror the new emperor might devise, Sporus chose the one thing that had been denied to him for years: control over his own fate. He committed suicide, finally escaping the nightmare that had begun with nothing more than an unfortunate resemblance. So there you have it, the story of Sporus, the slave who was tortured simply for looking like the wrong person at the wrong time. His face sealed his fate in ways that most of us can barely imagine. What happened to Sporus wasn't unique because it was evil. History is full of evil. It was unique because it shows how completely one person's reality can be twisted by another's power. In a world where emperors could reshape laws, armies, and entire civilizations, reshaping a single human being was just another Tuesday. The Romans preserved this story not because they thought it was particularly shocking, but because it perfectly captured something they understood about power, that it reveals who people really are when all limits are removed.